So what happens when you take an ancient myth, one about divine protection, and then just throw it into the brutal reality of a modern war zone? That's exactly what we're digging into today with Mahasweta Devi's incredible short story, Draupadi. It's a story that takes one of the most famous heroines from the Mahabharata and completely rewrites her for a world of political insurgency, state violence, and something like radical defiance. And right here, this is the core conflict that powers the whole story. On one side, you have the epic heroine, Draupadi. She's publicly shamed, but a god intervenes to save her modesty. On the other side, you have her modern counterpart, Draupadi. For her, there's no miracle. She's stripped bare by her captors, but then she does something unthinkable. She turns her own violated body into a weapon. And that reversal, that's exactly what we're going to unpack. Okay, so to really get why Devi's version is so revolutionary, we have to go back to the source. We need to understand what happened in the Mahabharata because Devi is taking apart that original scene piece by piece. So where does this all start? Well, it kicks off with just a spectacular failure of patriarchy. Draupadi, a queen, is literally gambled away in a rigged game of dice by her own husband. In that single moment, her honor, her status, her very identity, it's all reduced to a piece of property. And when the bet is lost, the winners come to collect. They drag her into the royal court, this space of law and masculine power, with one goal: to publicly strip her. This is meant to be the ultimate humiliation, designed to destroy not just her, but the honor of her husbands as well. And get this, her protectors, her 5 husbands, all these powerful men in the court, they just sit there. They do nothing. So with no one else to turn to, she does the only thing she can. She prays to a higher power, to the god Krishna, to save her from this shame. And this is where the miracle happens. As her enemies pull and pull at her sari, the fabric just becomes endless. They can't strip her. So in the original myth, divine order steps in. The woman's modesty is saved and patriarchal honor is kind of put back in place, all thanks to divine power, not human. Now, Mahasweta Devi takes that entire framework of humiliation and divine rescue and just smashes it against the hard wall of modern political reality. She takes the story into a very different kind of court and a very, very different kind of war. You really can't separate this story from the writer. Mahasweta Devi wasn't just an author. She was a serious activist. She spent years working with India's tribal or Adivasi communities. For her, writing wasn't just an art form, it was a political tool. It was a way to give a voice to people who didn't have one. Her story is set right in the middle of the Naxalite insurgency in the 1970s. This was a radical armed movement, and the government's response was incredibly brutal, especially in the rural areas where these tribal communities lived. So that's the world of her story, a world of state-sponsored violence and terror. And this is the world where we meet Draupadi Mahen. Now pay attention to that name. Draupadi is a tribal, everyday version of the very formal Draupadi. That little change in how you say the name signals a huge shift, from a mythical queen to a marginalized tribal woman. And her story is going to be a complete, powerful inversion of the myth. Now, unlike the queen in the palace, Draupadi is no passive victim. She's an active combatant, a revolutionary on a most wanted list, and she's being hunted by the state. She's captured in a forest, not a palace, by soldiers who see her as an enemy they need to break. And right here, the myth just shatters. There is no divine intervention, no endless sorry. As her translator Gayatri Spivak puts it, so bluntly, the soldiers easily succeed in stripping Draupadi. It's just the raw power of the state against the body of this woman, and there's no miracle coming to save her. And this is absolutely vital to understand. The stripping is just the beginning. The gang rape that follows isn't some random act of violence. In Devi's story, it is a calculated tool of the state. It's political torture, designed specifically to punish her and break the will of the revolution. Her body isn't a site for a miracle, it's a target for state power. So, right at this moment, which feels like the absolute lowest point of the story, Devi does something truly astonishing. The story pivots from assault to an act of confrontation that is just unbelievable. The story asks this really fundamental question. I mean, when you have been completely broken, physically and mentally, what power could you possibly have left? How do you even face the people who did this to you? Draupadi's answer rewrites the whole rulebook on power and shame. This is the moment everything changes. After hours of torture, she's brought before the officer in charge. They throw a cloth at her and order her to cover up, to go back to being modest and ashamed. And she says no. She doesn't just say no. She gets up and walks straight towards the officer, naked, battered, and bleeding. She turns her wounded body from being evidence of her shame into evidence of his crime. She forces him to look, to confront the raw, ugly truth of what he's done. She becomes what Spivak calls a terrifying superobject. Think about that. As an unarmed target, her presence alone makes the armed officer terrified. By refusing to cover herself, she rejects their script of shame and turns her body into a weapon. She's not a sexual object anymore, she's a political subject. And her body is the proof of his violence, and he can't face it. So what Devi is doing here is so much more than just a bleak update to an old story. It's a really profound political and feminist statement about power, violence, and what it means to resist. So let's break it down. First, she gives this epic story to the subaltern woman, someone living in a world with no divine safety nets. Second, she shows how the body, the very place of violation, can be turned into a site of resistance. Third, she exposes sexual violence for what it is in this context, not a private crime, but a public tool of state terror. And finally, she gives us a character who completely rejects shame, and in doing so, flips the power dynamic and absolutely terrifies her oppressor. And that's the haunting question Mahasweta Devi leaves us with. What happens to the whole system of power when the person who has been violated refuses to be shamed, and instead holds up their own body like a mirror, forcing the abuser to see the monster they've become? It's a question about where real power comes from, and about the incredible, almost unimaginable power of human defiance.